All right, so let's start this broadcast with some inputs that have just come in, where the Ukrainian forces claim to have downed another of Russian aircrafts over the capital city of Kyiv in the early hours of Friday, which then reportedly has also gone on to crash into a residential building and has set it on fire. It is unclear whether the aircraft was a manned one or whether this was some kind of a drone or a missile that has now rammed into one of the residential buildings in the capital city of Kyiv. The Kyivan municipal authorities have said that at least about 8 people have sustained injuries when the object crashed into an apartment block. And these are the visuals that have come in from Kyiv in the early hours of the morning, even before it was sunrise. And the Kyivan forces claim that they've managed to bring down one of the Russian aircraft, although it is not very clear whether this is a Russian aircraft or a drone or a missile that the Ukrainians claim that they managed to shoot down, which eventually, in fact, has gone on and crashed into a residential building, setting off a pretty big blaze there. And also on the second dawn of the Russian invasion into Ukraine, the Russian forces are pressing forth ever closer to the heart of the country, making their way steadily towards the capital, Kyiv. The Russian helicopters were seen hovering near Kyiv, near the Gostomel airbase. The US officials have said that the Russian forces are already pretty much on the outskirts of Kyiv, and 2 loud explosions were heard in Kyiv early this morning. The Ukraine's foreign minister has tweeted that horrific Russian rocket strikes are being conducted on the capital, and he's called on the world to once again to stop Putin in his steps as Russia is carrying forth this invasion into its neighbor. Meanwhile, in the capital city, Kyiv, a residential building was on fire. Meanwhile, in a midnight address, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has said that his country has been left alone to fight against Russia after the Kremlin launched a full-scale invasion. He also has warned that Russian sabotage groups had managed to enter into the capital city of Kyiv, and he's urged all residents in the city to be vigilant and to observe curfew rules.
Але є й друге. Ми залишаємось наодинці у захисті нашої держави. Хто готовий воювати разом з нами? Чесно, не бачу таких. Хто готовий дати Україні гарантію вступу до НАТО? Чесно, всі бояться.
Across Ukraine, according to reports that have come in, these have been officially confirmed, at least about 137 Ukrainian nationals, both military personnel and civilians, being killed in the first day of the fighting. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has called for conscripts and reservists countrywide to come forth and fight as he is ordered for a general mobilization. Now, according to reports that have come in, at least about 100,000 people have been internally displaced within Ukraine as Russian missiles continue to rain down on Ukrainian cities. And the first of the Ukrainian refugees have already begun to pour into neighboring nations such as Hungary and Romania, and Poland has said that it is gearing up for as many as about 1 million refugees from Ukraine. All right, now to give us more insights in terms of how this conflict would, of course, play out in the coming days, we're joined in by James Brown, an Associate Professor of Political Science from the Temple University, and he's joining us live on this broadcast from Tokyo. Mr. Brown, thank you very much indeed for taking your time out and speaking to us here on WION. And let me begin by asking you this. It is day 2 of the Russian invasion into Ukraine. And early this morning, the reports that are coming in is that missile strikes have been continued by the Russian forces on key facilities in Ukraine. How much further do you think Russia would be willing to, in fact, go on with this war on Ukraine?
So if we look at the actions that have been taken by the Russian military so far, if we also look at some of the statements that have come from President Putin, it seems very clear that they are determined to implement regime change within Ukraine. So the Russian forces are clearly heading towards the capital. They're not limiting their activities to the east of the country. So I think that what we're likely to see is that this will now concentrate around the Ukrainian capital, and there will be an effort by the Russian forces to decapitate the Ukrainian regime.
At this point of time, do you think the Russians would be satisfied with the regime change in Kyiv, or do you think Russia would want to annex more territory from Ukraine?
In a sense, the two things are connected, because if they install a puppet regime, a regime which is pro-Moscow, then that opens the door to do what they wish with Ukraine. So I don't think it's really either or. I think that they would want to have some form of a kind of puppet government, at least to give the pretense that Ukraine has retained its independence, even though it would actually have come under Moscow's control.
You know, but the fact is, Russia has experimented with installing friendly regimes in Kyiv. President Yanukovych, the former president, in 2014 was deposed because he was seen as too friendly to Moscow. People rose up against him. Would Russia actually want to install another puppet regime, so to speak, in Kyiv, and will Russia be able to do it?
Well, this is part of the reason why this is such a huge strategic miscalculation by Putin, that he has put himself in a situation which is very, very difficult to get out of. So exactly as you say, let's say Russia does install a puppet regime. It's going to be incredibly unpopular. It is going to have no real popular support whatsoever. It's going to be entirely reliant on Moscow's constant economic and military support. And so that risks becoming a years-long problem for Russia. And it's likely that you would continue to see large-scale public protests and also potentially an insurgency against that Russian-installed regime.
And also looking at the Western response so far, although the United States and its allies have been talking about wide-scale financial sanctions to make the cost very high for the Russians as they carry out this invasion, the fact of the matter is the United States has said that it is not imposing any energy-related sanctions. The SWIFT payments system has also not been taken off for the Russian banking system. With that being the case, is there any kind of financial deterrence that's been created by the West for Russia to now back off?
Yes, I think there is now serious consequences financially for Russia. The initial sanctions that were announced earlier this week were relatively weak, in actual fact, in the hope that would serve as a deterrent role. But now actually the invasion has gone ahead. In particular, the United States has gone further, and in really targeting several of the Russian banks, cutting them off from dollar-denominated trading, dollar-denominated transactions, that really will have a big impact on the Russian financial system. So yes, they haven't decided to target SWIFT as yet. They've also left alone the majority of the energy sector. That's primarily to ensure that they don't end up damaging too much European countries and other kind of Western states. But I think nonetheless, the latest measures will have a serious impact on the Russian economy.
Now, looking at the crisis that is playing out in Ukraine, one of the reasons as to why we are in this situation is because of NATO's policy, which is a little ambiguous when it comes to inducting new nations that would want to be a part of the NATO military alliance. Now, the political dispensation in Kyiv is more inclined to joining NATO. It is friendly towards the NATO military alliance, and that's precisely the reason why we are here. Ukraine is not a part of the military alliance of NATO, and therefore NATO is not duty-bound to defend it. But in the interim, Russia has invaded Ukraine, and it is going about dismembering a sovereign nation. Will NATO need to relook its policy of how it goes about inducting new nations into the military alliance?
Well, I think you can have a debate about the historical situation and whether Ukraine could have been given membership at an earlier date. That ship has sailed, unfortunately. But I don't think we can really look at the NATO membership issue as a real explanation for Moscow's actions here, because whilst they've used that as an excuse, a justification, it actually was not on the cards. Ukraine has made it very clear that they want to join the NATO alliance, but that was not an active discussion. There was no prospect of Ukraine joining NATO within the short or medium term. And so in actual fact, that has really been used by Moscow as an excuse for this action. Going forward, however, I think what you will see is that there will be more openness to membership of other states. And I think perhaps at the front of the queue would be Finland and Sweden. They will now consider whether they want to join the NATO alliance. And if they do make that decision, then they will clearly be welcomed within it.
And also, this conflict that is unfolding in Ukraine also lays down the template for future conflicts that we could perhaps look at. Now, here we're looking at a sovereign nation that neighbors Russia, that has been invaded in this manner, and despite all the support and solidarity that the West has extended to Ukraine, Ukraine pretty much is all alone facing the Russian onslaught. Do you think Ukraine has been let down by the United States and its allies in this confrontation with Russia?
That will certainly be the way that it will feel within Ukraine. However, to be fair to the United States and its allies, you can ask, in the preceding few months, what more could they do? If they had moved to actually promise military assistance in the sense of an actual commitment to collective security, then the risk of that is that would potentially mean conflict between NATO and Russia, which would be even more disastrous than the situation that we find ourselves in. So I'm sure Washington would say that they are doing their best to support Ukraine in every way possible, with the exception of actually committing to send US troops to Ukraine. But I think that it is something of broader significance. And I speak to you sitting here in Tokyo. And within East Asia, a lot of the thinking will be about the consequences for this region, and whether that could lead to an emboldening of, in particular, China to potentially take aggressive action to seize the disputed islands that it has with Japan, or even to potentially move on Taiwan.
You know, the reluctance that the United States has shown in terms of, lending more support to Ukraine, will the crisis in Ukraine become a template for Taiwan?
Well, that's certainly the concern, but there are some differences here. That the United States does not really have any security kind of obligation in a legal sense towards protecting Ukraine. It's different in the case of Taiwan, where the United States has the Taiwan Relations Act, which is a stronger commitment to helping Taiwan to defend itself. So they're not exactly equivalents here. But there are some concerns that if the international order, based on the principle that you cannot change borders by force, or at least you shouldn't do so, if that becomes destabilized, then it could have many implications, including with regard to Taiwan.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Brown, for joining us and getting us all those insights. This, of course, remains a very crucial time in terms of what is likely to happen in this war that Russia is waging on Ukraine. The next 24 to 48 hours, of course, remain very crucial. WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.